What would happen if the wisest man in the world, the one who received knowledge directly from God, ended his life in disgrace? King Solomon not only ruled Israel with wisdom and power, but also built the magnificent Temple of Jerusalem, earning great renown and amassing unimaginable wealth. However, glory does not last forever. After years of dominance and splendor, something began to shift within his heart. Solomon, the renowned king of wisdom, succumbed to his own desires, making choices that led him to an unforeseen fate. The foreign women he welcomed into his palace, the pagan gods he allowed into his kingdom, and his gradual detachment from God's will slowly weakened his reign to the point of no return. His story serves as a powerful reminder that even the greatest can fall. Today, we will delve into the final days of his life, from his golden era to the dark shadow of ruin. A tale of power, wisdom, betrayal, and repentance. Stay with us, because what you are about to hear will forever change the way you see Solomon's story. And before we continue, support us by leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps us keep bringing you content like this. Now, let's begin. Solomon's rise to the throne of Israel was far from easy. After the death of his father, King David, Jerusalem became shrouded in intrigue and betrayal. His brother Adonijah sought to claim the throne, relying on his popularity among military leaders and priests. However, God had a different plan. The prophet Nathan and Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, intervened just in time. David, lying on his deathbed, confirmed God's will. Solomon was to be the next king. Thus, before the eyes of the people, Solomon was anointed in Gihon, riding King David's mule, and declared the rightful ruler of Israel. 1 Kings 1:38-40. This was the first step toward what would become one of the most legendary reigns in history. From the very beginning, Solomon distinguished himself from other kings with his deep humility and desire to serve God. He did not seek power or riches. When God granted him the opportunity to ask for anything, he chose wisdom to rule with justice. God responded with an unprecedented promise. Behold, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has been no one like you before, nor shall any arise after you. 1 Kings 3:12. This divine gift became the cornerstone of his rule. Solomon became renowned for his wisdom, his ability to resolve disputes, and his unparalleled intelligence. The case of the two women disputing the motherhood of a baby is one of the most iconic examples of Solomon's wisdom. Instead of making a hasty judgment, he proposed cutting the child in half, knowing that the true mother would rather surrender her baby than see him die. 1 Kings 3:25-27. His fame spread and his kingdom flourished. But behind every great success story lies a hidden weakness. For Solomon, it was his love for wealth, political alliances, and luxury that began to sow the seeds of his downfall. The man who had started his reign with humility and devotion slowly began to drift away from the right path, and the worst was yet to come. Now that we have seen how his rule began, let's move to the moment when everything started to change. The Temple of Jerusalem was Solomon's greatest achievement, a dream of his father David that he finally brought to life. It was meant to be the dwelling place of God's presence among his people. The construction took 7 years and used the finest materials, cedar wood from Lebanon, pure gold, and expertly carved stones of unmatched precision. 1 Kings 6:14-22. When the temple was completed, Solomon gathered all of Israel for its dedication. During the ceremony, he offered a prayer that reflected his devotion to God, acknowledging his greatness and asking that his people always find refuge in that sacred place. 1 Kings 8:22-30. God responded by filling the temple with his glory in the form of a dense cloud, symbolizing his approval. 1 Kings 8:10-11. With the completion of the temple, Solomon reached the pinnacle of his reign. Israel enjoyed peace, its economy thrived, and his wisdom was revered throughout the world. The Queen of Sheba, captivated by his fame, traveled to Jerusalem with a grand entourage bearing gifts. She was astonished by Solomon's intelligence and the splendor of his kingdom. 1 Kings 10:1-9. Yet amid all this magnificence, a dangerous seed was beginning to take root in his heart. Political alliances led him to marry foreign women, and with them came their gods. At first, Solomon remained steadfast in his faith, but over time, his love for these women led him to commit the unthinkable. He allowed pagan temples to be built in Israel. 1 Kings 11:1-4. God had warned that this would bring ruin upon Israel, but Solomon, blinded by his own greatness, ignored the warning. He had gone from being the king who built a temple for God to being the ruler who permitted the construction of shrines for foreign deities. This marked the beginning of his downfall. In the next chapter, we will see how Solomon's poor choices distanced him from God and how the consequences of his actions changed the history of Israel forever. At this point, we begin to see Solomon's true weakness. Despite his great wisdom, he made a fatal mistake: his excessive love for foreign women. The Bible states that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. 1 Kings 11:3. Many of them were princesses from neighboring kingdoms with whom he forged political alliances. However, in doing so, he allowed their pagan customs to infiltrate Israel. God had explicitly warned the Israelites not to marry women from other nations who worshipped false gods, as this would lead them away from him. Deuteronomy 7:3-4. Yet Solomon disregarded this warning and, over time, went from tolerating idolatry to actively participating in it. He built altars for deities such as Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and Molech, some of whom demanded human sacrifices. How could the man who had constructed the temple for God end up erecting shrines for pagan gods? This reveals how power and complacency can cloud the judgment of even the wisest man. But the problem was not just idolatry. Each of these actions had profound political and spiritual consequences. Seeing their king's example, the people of Israel began to drift away from worshipping the true God. Solomon was planting the seeds of corruption that would ultimately divide his kingdom. Solomon's story delivers a sobering lesson. When we begin to compromise our values little by little, we often fail to realize that we are walking the path to ruin. And although he did not yet know it, God had already decreed the fate of his kingdom. The once faithful king of Israel was now ensnared in a cycle of spiritual decay. His marriages to foreign women had not only led him into idolatry, but had also tainted the land of Israel with altars and pagan rituals. This sin did not go unnoticed by God. The Lord, who had so abundantly blessed Solomon, finally declared his judgment. In 1 Kings 11:11-13, God said, "Because you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days, for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of the hand of your son." God's punishment was clear. The kingdom that Solomon had ruled with such splendor would be divided. Yet in an act of mercy, God would not bring this judgment upon him during his lifetime, but rather upon his son's reign. The cost of disobedience had been set, and although the king still resided in the splendor of his palace, ruin was already approaching. But God did not merely decree the kingdom's future. He also allowed Solomon's enemies to rise against him. The once peaceful ruler, who had enjoyed years of stability on his borders, now faced emerging threats. Hadad the Edomite and Rezon of Syria became persistent thorns in Israel's side. 1 Kings 11:14-25. However, the most dangerous enemy was Jeroboam, a man secretly preparing to take control of the northern kingdom. As the threat became more evident, Solomon desperately tried to hold on to his power, but his rule was already fractured. No matter how much wealth he had, how many palaces he built, or how great his wisdom was, without God's blessing, his empire was slowly crumbling. Solomon's life teaches us a harsh reality. When we turn away from God, even the greatest fortune cannot prevent our downfall. And though the king was still alive, his story was approaching its bitter end. The final years of Solomon's life were vastly different from his youth. The man who had built God's temple was now ensnared in the darkness of his own guilt and decline. His wisdom, once his greatest gift, could no longer save him from the consequences of his actions. The Bible does not provide many details about his death, but in 1 Kings 11:41-43, it is written, "Now the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? And the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his stead." After reigning for 40 years, Solomon died, leaving behind a legacy of both glory and downfall. He was buried in the city of David, and his son Rehoboam inherited the throne. But, as God had foretold, the kingdom would not remain united for long. When Rehoboam took power, trouble quickly arose. The people were frustrated with the heavy taxes and labor burdens that Solomon had imposed to sustain his extravagant lifestyle. They pleaded with Rehoboam to ease their hardships, but instead of listening, the new king responded harshly, saying, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions." 1 Kings 12:11. That was the breaking point. The 10 northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, rebelled against Rehoboam and established the kingdom of Israel. Meanwhile, Rehoboam retained control only over Judah and Benjamin. Thus, the once mighty kingdom that Solomon had spent decades building was torn in two, fulfilling God's prophecy. Solomon's end was neither heroic nor glorious. He died knowing that his kingdom was doomed, that his choices had led him to ruin, and that despite all his wisdom, he had failed in the most important aspect, his relationship with God. Solomon's story is one of the most striking in the Bible, not only because of his greatness, but because of his tragic downfall. It reveals a profound truth: neither wealth nor power nor intelligence can replace faithfulness to God. Solomon himself wrote in Ecclesiastes 1:2, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." These words summarize his final reflection on life. After having everything, he realized that without God, all was meaningless. But what lessons can we learn from his story? 1. Wisdom without obedience is not enough. Solomon possessed the greatest gift, but he failed to use it to remain faithful to God. Knowledge alone is worthless if we do not apply it correctly. Small compromises can lead to destruction. Solomon did not become an idolater overnight. It was a gradual process, starting with small, seemingly insignificant decisions that ultimately led him far from God. 3. Success can be a dangerous test. While Solomon faced hardships, he remained faithful, but when he experienced peace and prosperity, he let his guard down and fell into sin. 4. What we build can be destroyed by our own actions. Solomon constructed the most magnificent temple in history, yet his own sins led to the division of his kingdom. Solomon's story is a powerful warning for all of us. No matter how high we rise in life, if we turn away from God, our fate will be no different from his. If this story has made you reflect, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and turn on notifications to receive more powerful biblical stories. See you in the next video.